Welcome to the Wisconsin Literacy Fall Virtual Conference session, Strategies to Support Adult Learners with Reading Difficulties. Our guest presenter today is Angela Stokes. Very happy to have her with us. She has worked with youth and adults who struggle learning to read for over 20 years in both the public schools and in the private sector. She has taught pre-service teachers how to teach reading for a number of years at both the university level, for a number of years at the university level, and she currently works for the Center for Applied Research and Educational Improvement at the University of Minnesota as a literacy specialist. She has a master's degree in special education and a master's degree in reading, and we are so very happy to have you here with us, Angie, and I am going to pull up your slideshow and hand it over to you.
Thanks so much. The first thing, I just wanted to thank everyone on the call for the work that they do. It's very, very important to people personally, and then also to community. So thank you so much for your work. I know that it's not always easy and oftentimes challenging. I put a slide, I put a quote here by Mark Seidenberg, Dr. Mark Seidenberg, who works at the University of Wisconsin-Madison around reading, and that reading is a task. But what students struggle with is not the task itself, but the little components that make up the task of reading. So most of my information today will focus around those tasks and things that make it difficult for students to learn how to read. I am hopeful that this is more of a conversation than a presentation. I have information to provide, but I'm mostly interested in what you would like to learn. So please feel free to interrupt me with a hand up. My understanding from Shannon is that somebody is watching for that. And then if you have any questions, if you wanted to put those in the chat as we go along, I think someone is watching that too. What I'm hopeful we can do to start is take maybe a minute and have folks just put in the chat things they're interested or they're wondering about with adult learners who struggle with reading. So if we could take a minute to do that first, that will help me make sure that I cover what folks are interested in.
I'll be monitoring the chat for you, and we have one comment so far, and it says, in respect with reading challenges in native language like Spanish.
Thanks so much. Anything anyone else is dying to know about?
Okay, now they're coming in. The next one says teaching reading to adults whose first language doesn't have a written system.
Sure.
The next one is how to teach students with dyslexia. And the next comment is from a tutor saying, I am tutoring a 53-year-old man who has never been able to read. He does have dyslexia. How can I help him to remember the sounds units, etc. better?
Okay, thanks so much. That's helpful for me. We're going to review these at the end, but I will try to hit on those as we go along. I'm just reading the last one here. Okay, Shannon, do you want to move me forward, please? Okay, so what I'm hoping to accomplish today, so by the end of today, I'm hoping that you understand what reading difficulties are, understand that students with reading difficulties, including dyslexia, can learn to read with targeted instruction. If we look at the research in reading, 95% of the population can learn to read. that's not how much of our population currently is literate, but that's the potential that we have. Understand where you can go to help with instructional questions, and then understand what you can do to help support your learners. Shannon, what I'm going to tell you is my screen does not always show the entire slide, so I might have to flip back and forth here. Again, please ask questions. Like, I really hope that you ask questions today. You type in the chat. What I want to also just be clear up front is that I'm not going to be recommending specific programs, rather suggesting that you talk to your literacy agency and your regional consultant for that. There's excellent resources at your agencies, and there's excellent resources that your literacy consultants have. And I know different agencies focus on sometimes different populations of students and want to use different resources. So just upfront, I have suggestions more about how to teach, not what materials to use. Thanks, Shannon. So just to kind of ground us, I know you all are in the work, so you understand that lots of folks need help. But that was a full stop period. But according to the U.S. Department of Education, 54% of adults, so about 130 million people, lack proficiency in literacy, meaning that they read below a 6th grade equivalent. And then the second piece I put in here relates to school, but what I would tell you is that 68% of 4th graders are reading below the basic proficiency and 39% below basic proficiency. So we have a lot of adults that struggle, but we have a lot of children coming up that will turn into adults that likely will struggle. There's not a lot of evidence that in schools, if students are struggling by 3rd grade, they tend to continue to struggle throughout high school. So I guess my point here is just that your work is really important, and it will continue to be important for the foreseeable future. And moving forward, Shannon, thanks. And then why is it necessary to work with adults? So again, many of you know this from the folks that you work with, but low literacy is connected to lots and lots of money in healthcare costs. Because Americans can't read well, they struggle with reading what's on their prescriptions. They struggle to understand health information. And low literacy costs a lot of money each year because folks are underemployed. And could be in different jobs if they had better literacy skills. Can you move me forward, Shannon? So again, why that work is so necessary is because, I mean, if you take a minute to think about in your day what you have to read. So when you go to the grocery store, when you go to a conference at your child's school, when you go to work, there's just a number of things that you're behind with if you can't read, and it just prevents people from being able to get ahead. So we tend to see higher levels of illiteracy in folks that are below the poverty line, have poor health, and it continues to contribute to the gap that we have in society between many different groups of folks. I'm going to give you a little bit of background in reading. I tried to be real careful about how much, just because I could spend a lot of time explaining how the brain learns how to read. I'm not sure that when you're working with folks, what you need to understand is that in order for folks to learn how to read, you need to lay down some pathways in their brain. I have provided some reading. If this is interesting to you, I have lots and lots of reading for you that I included at the end. But the biggest thing to understand is that there's 2 pieces to reading. The first piece is understanding the words on the page. So can you actually figure out that THE says the? The second part of that is language comprehension. So if you can read the words on the page, do you have the background knowledge? Do you have the vocabulary? Do you understand how sentences are put together so that you can actually comprehend? Because what we're going to talk about this in a minute, but you likely will come across students who can't recognize the words on the page. So therefore they can't read and they can't comprehend. But you may also have some students that you work with that can read the words on the page, but they don't have the background knowledge or the vocabulary that they need to actually understand the text as a whole. So those are two very different things. And both are necessary to look at when you're working with learners. All right, Shannon. I put some information in here specifically on dyslexia. Oh, did you?
I accidentally went, go ahead.
Okay. So common reading difficulties, there's generally 3 different kinds. So as I said, specific word reading. So folks have a hard time just identifying what the words say on the page. The second one is comprehension difficulties. So they don't have the background knowledge, they're missing the vocabulary, things like that. And then you will have some students, and these are your probably most challenging students to design instruction for, and they're missing both. So it takes, you have to work on both. What does the text say? And then what is the background and vocabulary you need to understand that? So those are the 3 different difficulties that we typically see in children and adults. Okay, so dyslexia is the term for a reading disability that likely gets used the most. Sometimes folks will come in with an actual diagnosis from a medical doctor or a professional. Sometimes folks won't, they'll just say, I have dyslexia. I wanted to just explain specifically what that is. I took this from the International Dyslexic Association. So dyslexia is a specific learning disability that's neurobiological in origin. What that means, it's something that's different about a person's brain that makes it harder for them to learn how to read. The reason that's important is because oftentimes folks will take their inability to read personally. It's nothing that they have control over. It's just how their brain is set up, and it has to be trained in order to be able to read. It's characterized by difficulties with accurate or fluent word recognition. And then oftentimes you see that in poor spelling and decoding abilities. Decoding means that you can read the words on the page. So you understand that S says S, and if you see that in SAT, it's going to say SAT. The difficulties result from usually a deficit in phonological component of language. Phono is sound. So oftentimes without even having letters, folks that have dyslexia will have a hard time putting sounds together. So if I said, if I have the sounds at, can you tell me what that word is? They will have a hard time coming up with sat. That you see that in young children, 5 years old. You see that in 18-year-olds and older. Secondary consequences for this are oftentimes reading comprehension, largely because they haven't been readers. So the way that you gain background knowledge and vocabulary is by reading. And if you've been a struggling reader, you're likely not going to be reading to pick up extra vocabulary and background knowledge. So we sometimes call that a secondary consequence or a double deficit, depending on who you're talking to. But I bring up dyslexia because you're probably going to hear that the most. How prevalent is it? Depending on what the statisticians are, it can affect anywhere between 15 to 20% of the population. That's 41 million adults. So lots of folks, 1 in 4, 1 in 5, 1 in 5. 80 to 90% of those have learning disabilities. That doesn't mean that they were diagnosed with a learning disability in school. It just means that likely if they went back, that's what that would come up as. And then it's the most common of all neurocognitive disorders. Biggest thing to know is it's pretty prevalent. So who has dyslexia? So dyslexia is something that learners are typically born with, regardless of their race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status. It doesn't matter if your parents went to college, if your parents didn't go to college. It doesn't matter if you're wealthy or not. It moves through all demographics equally. Adults can get onset dyslexia, but that usually occurs after a brain injury or dementia. So usually it's something that folks are born with. It can run in families. There are some folks investigating genetic links. Exact causes aren't known, but typically runs in families. Important to know that some adults are never diagnosed. So you might be working with folks that are dyslexic that they just have never been diagnosed. And then it varies in intensity. So some folks will have, mild form of dyslexia, and some folks have an extremely debilitating form of dyslexia.
You may see there's a question in the chat asking if drug use can cause dyslexia.
Well, that is an excellent question. And so what I'm going to tell you is I have never seen the research on that. I haven't seen it mentioned in the research. But because when you're older, it can be triggered by a brain injury. I wonder about that. I don't know. It's an interesting question. Now I'm going to have to look that up. Thanks. So another thing to understand is that dyslexia has no relationship to intelligence. So a lot of times folks will internalize that there's something wrong with them or that they're dumb. They lack intelligence. That's not accurate at all. Individuals with dyslexia are not more or less intelligent than anyone else. What I will tell you, having worked with a significant number of folks who are dyslexic and looking in the research, is oftentimes folks with dyslexia have such amazing compensatory skills and abilities to be creative, that they often have not more strengths than others, but have some really unique strengths that can be leveraged when you work with them, and leveraged in very different ways. So leveraged in the workforce, leveraged at school. So just really, really unique. They've had to overcome a number of things. So usually have really high resiliency also. Other assumptions to be aware of. So oftentimes it's assumed that students have sufficient skills to actually read and they're just struggling with comprehension. That's not usually the case. They often have a really significant difficulty with word recognition. And so oftentimes you have to go way, way, way back to the basics. What will happen sometimes with adults is that they will have memorized lots and lots of words, which gets you a little bit in reading. But if you're looking like at a technical manual, think about like automotive, those aren't words that you're typically going to have memorized. So oftentimes you have to pay real close attention to what folks, if they're memorizing the words or they actually can figure out a new word that they're not familiar with. This is a trick that some folks will use. So sometimes folks will have special dyslexia glasses, or I've seen like, we're going to use different colored highlighters, or we're going to put transparencies over with different colors, or look at special paper. Dyslexia is not a visual disorder. It has to do with our brain's ability to take apart and put sounds back together. So using all special glasses, fonts, special paper is not going to ever help. So if folks are coming to you and that's what they've typically been told to do, I would not recommend you continue doing that with them. It's not going to cause any harm, but that's not going to be helpful in helping them. The other piece, and this, frankly, I would imagine you deal with a lot as working with adult learners, but as I said before, because they're struggling to read, they often lack vocabulary and background knowledge. And then it will also impact their ability to spell and write, making it difficult for them to express themselves. So what I would recommend often, when I did this in schools, I did this when I was working with adults at the university, but in addition to working on reading, concurrently working on writing. So if you're having students read, if you're working on like multisyllabic words and you're targeting something, I would also have them be writing at the same time. So you are building both their reading and writing skills concurrently. They will build quicker together. But lots of times folks come in and they need to work on reading. And if you can, I would also strongly recommend that you try to get them to work on their writing. The other thing it's really important to understand is like, it's never too late. So someone said I think 53-year-old or 54-year-old, like it's never too late to learn how to read. Even if folks are severely dyslexic, they can learn. It will take more effort than those without. So I think one of the questions asked about what to do to help folks remember, what I would tell you is oftentimes with learners that are struggling with reading, what they need is more repetition. So as the tutor, getting more examples, having them set up more practice, making sure that that practice has some feedback to it. But oftentimes they simply need more and more repetitions. So just the main takeaway here is it's never too late. All right, Shannon. As you have learners come in, I think each agency has a way of assessing them. But the most important thing that you can do to help your learner when they're coming in is figuring out where they're at. And it's important to assess where they're at with their word recognition. So what letters do they know the sounds for? What prefixes do they know the meanings for? And how can they put those together? And then additionally, working on some comprehension assessments also. Your agencies have those established, but making sure you're doing that. And then as you go along in your instruction, making sure you're taking little dipsticks to see how they're responding to your learning. But again, it's just crucial that you are assessing both pieces of reading, both the word recognition and then the language comprehension, to figure out what it is you need to work on.
Angie, there's another question in the chat.
Sure.
Essentially, it's asking, how fluent should we expect a student to read after learning all their sounds and with good oral vocabulary?
Well, that's a good question. What I would tell you is like, what is the reader's goal? Like, what are they trying to get to? If you're, I'm going to have Marcia have to help me with this because I can't remember what it is, but like if the student is studying for the GRE, there's a level that they have to get to. Like that's the level that I would work to have students get to. I would tell you when you're working with adults, lots of your targets are dependent on what it is they want. So are they trying to get a promotion at work? Are they trying to read their students' communications from their teacher? Are they trying to pass the GRE? The GED, what is it that they're trying to get to? That's where I would tell you that you need to work towards. Likely you have a limited time with students also. So getting as much accomplished in the time is important, understanding that the amount of time you have might not get you where you need. The other thing I would tell you is that when you're working with students, what is most important is their accuracy before their rate. So you want to when you're working with a student and you're looking at where they're at, you want to make sure that they're as accurate as possible applying those rules. So applying figuring out what the words are before you're working really hard on their rate. Does that answer the question? I feel like I didn't answer the question because I couched it up in what the student is what the student's goal is. So
Angie?
Yeah.
Angela, you answered the question for me. Thank
Okay.
you.
Angela, what do you mean rate? You were contrasting the two.
Yep. So the accuracy would be like if you read all the words correctly, but the rate is how quickly they're reading.
Oh, okay.
So you have to have a certain rate in what you're reading in order to free your brain up to comprehend. And like the typical rate is 150 words per minute, regardless of what level students are at, 4th grade and up. If you can get them to read 150 words in a minute, that gives their brain enough time, that's automatic enough in their brain to get them to be able to understand the text. The challenge is, like, think about if you're picking up something that's really hard to read, like let's just say you want to review your college son's physics textbook, you're going to read that much slower than you're going to pick up Christina Hanna's new novel. So the rate's a little bit tricky too. You have to think about what they're reading. Does that help, Deb? Okay.
It looks
Okay,
like
so-
Carolyn, one quick, it looks like Carolyn has her hand up. Do you have time for a quick question
Yeah,
here?
of course.
Yeah, I have an older gentleman who has like superb vocabulary because he, you know, he has a lot of background knowledge just
Yeah.
from living as long as he has. But he really, really struggles with the phonics.
Yeah.
He's doing his best to write interview requests, contact people outside of the Department of Corrections he needs to get in contact with, but he's still struggling. So I'm just wondering what my expectations should be of him, because he really doesn't get, excuse me, 100% of my time. It'd be nice, but my classes are sometimes all of these guys
Sure.
plus PSL, and it's sometimes up to 9 students in an hour.
So can you ask me your question again? I'm sorry.
Basically, what can I expect of this student as far as his fluency, his grasping phonics and maintaining it, you know, when I don't get to spend like a whole hour every day with him or every other day.
Sure. Does he have the ability, like, can he practice anything when you're not with him?
Yes, I gave him a large print dictionary, and he also has a list of common words that people use in everyday language. Excuse me. That he likes to practice spelling those. I also have a lower vocabulary one that works on vocabulary and context, being able to read the words, being able to manipulate the words. So that's what he's working on when he's not with me.
Yeah. So if there's anything that, so I would guess like I think you said a dictionary that's going to give a definition. Like if there's any like connected text that he could read, that's at his level, because and by his level, I would say something where he could pick it up, and if there was 100 words, he wouldn't miss more than 5 to 8 of those words. But that will get his brain to just be practicing and practicing and practicing. It sounds like from how you described him that his vocabulary is strong. So that's why I was just wondering if there's something he can practice that the text is connected. Does that make sense?
He uses a lot, or how should I put it? He depends a lot on the context in the sentence, because he can usually figure out when something doesn't belong there if he's read it, and
Sure.
he'll go back at it.
Okay.
He still does a lot of looking at the first part of the word and you know, making the guess rather than looking at all the parts of the word.
Yeah. So the challenging piece as a tutor to work with the student is like they have habits that we would rather have not them had, like looking at the first sound and then guessing. But that frankly is a reminder to him, like he's going to have to break that habit. But using context clues isn't a bad way to figure out a word. So I'm just does he do that dependably? Like he can do that without a lot of help from you?
He can usually do all of the exercises, and when he gets stuck, he'll ask me questions about it. He might recognize the word in one sentence, and then the next sentence he doesn't recognize it at all. But that's something I see quite a bit. Most of my students, I give them the PASS test or the core phonics test before
Sure.
I even work with them, so I have an idea of what's causing the problem. most of them have segmenting and blending issues.
Yeah. Yeah, because they're pulling the words apart and putting them back together. That's typical for what folks struggle with. Even if they can do the sounds in isolation, they will struggle with putting them together. Do you have like, so I'm maybe making a poor assumption, but what I'm hearing is that like you're giving him something from a program. Like, can you give him like I don't know what his reading level is, but is there like a low level novel you could give him or something that has him reading a lot? Does that make sense?
He prefers to do things right now because he's getting close to release, doing things that he can apply to what he's doing with release
Okay.
and or things that'll help him when he first gets out. So I try to take that into consideration as well. He does his best to try spelling the sentences that he would like to use, and then he just double checks them with me before he sends off a note to his social worker or whomever.
Okay. And does he have the ability to use it's like speech, like can he talk into anything? Like speech to print?
He actually does not have that option, and the Department of Corrections were kind of limited based on security and money as far as what kind of devices we can have.
Sure. So he's writing out notes. He's not like sending an email.
Right.
Okay.
They're all allowed to send like notes to family and friends
Sure.
via
Okay.
a kiosk, but I don't know how much of that he does.
Okay. Yeah. The other thing that then like thinking, I'm sure you're doing this, but so I might be a mute, but like thinking about, he's going to have to go out and like maybe he'll want to get a library card or like making up some situations for him. And then having him write, like just practicing his writing in different situations, if that was possible.
Yeah, I think that'll be good. I'll sit down with him and write down a few goals he has of things that he wants to do immediately upon release and see what we can come up with.
Yeah. Anything
There are
else?
two more questions in
Sure.
the chat. One is going back to, you were talking about rate and accuracy, and Anna asks if that is the fluency that is talked about in the trainings that Wisconsin Literacy provides.
I would guess yes, but there's three parts. The part I left off is called prosody, which I'm probably sure they talk about. And that's like, you stop at a period, you have a voice inflection at a question mark. The reason I left it off is because frankly, it's usually a byproduct of listening to folks read and reading. So it's not something that typically there's research to support working on, but so is fluency covered in your training, Shannon? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, it is.
And then what you said is that there was two?
Yes, and there are more coming in, but the next one is in regards to a new agency, and they're asking about assessments besides TABE or CASAs. Are there other paper and pencil assessments that are relatively basic? And I don't know, Angie, if you can answer.
Well, I can tell you I'm going to defer to Marcia and Beth and Shannon's group, but what I will tell you is nice job using the core. So that's my favorite assessment actually. So I think the person that I was speaking with earlier was using the core phonics assessment. So if I was asking my opinion, that's what I would tell you. So good job.
Okay, and then the next one seems to be more of a comment than a question. It says using manipulatives can help segmenting and blending sounds so that
Yep.
there is more of a multisensory approach.
Yep. So pushing those together, using the boxes to push the sounds. Yep. Those are all, that's really good.
Okay, and the next question, to summarize it, is how realistic is it for somebody to overcome dyslexia?
That's a good question. Again, I would tell you, so you don't get rid of dyslexia. Like it goes with you for life, but you can become a better reader. So I recognize that when you're working with folks that are incarcerated, it may be challenging to work with technology. But if you're not working with folks that have, and they have access to technology, I would tell you what you want to concurrently do is teach them how to use technology. So how do you use like voice to text? How do you Google can read everything to you. So teaching people to do that. So I would tell you that part of working with someone who has dyslexia is figuring out how to teach them to be a better reader, but then also teaching them how to use tools that they can use while they're doing that. Does that make sense to that question? The challenge you all have, which I recognize is different than when a student is like trapped in public school, is you have them for a limited amount of time. So you're trying to get as much done as you possibly can in a short amount of time. So what I would tell you is if you had an infinite amount of time and they wanted to stay with you for 5 years, you would get further than the person who comes in for, you know, they want to be a better reader and they have 3 months. So. Any other questions right now?
Those are the only ones for now. I would
Okay.
suggest you go ahead and finish up the presentation. We'll come back to some of the earlier questions that were asked.
Okay. What I would tell you is any assessment that you do is important to explain the results to your learner. They're adults. I would tell you the same thing with children, like they need to understand where they're struggling so that they can set targets and support themselves. The other thing is that is helping the learner to understand that with effort, they can learn to read. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but can you move that forward, Shannon? Again, I talked about this a little bit based on your assessment results when you're designing that instruction. These are from the International Dyslexic Center. This is their recommendations. So teaching children to identify and break words into syllable types. Not everybody does that, but that is a way to teach students. Second, when and how to use multisyllabic words by blending those parts together. So you can do that by teaching students how to peel off prefixes, how to peel off suffixes, and then understand that there's some words that don't follow a pattern. The challenge or the thing to remember is that more words follow a pattern than not. And if adults are memorizing words, they're not going to get very far very fast. Okay, Shannon. The other 3 things, I mentioned this a little bit, is while you're teaching prefixes and suffixes and roots, teach them the meanings. So you can be teaching comprehension at the same time as you're working on their decoding skills. Again, how to break words apart. And then some folks will have specific ways on how they do that. It's usually called structural analysis. That is up to you. Up to your agency if they have a way to do that. The thing, Stephen Dexter is a psychologist who works out of Milwaukee. And I just love him. He always, mostly because he's got a compassionate heart, but going to school day after day, week after week for years while being unable to read or read well is frequent and repetitive trauma for the students. So you are working with adults who have experienced a significant amount of trauma around reading. Typically. So they have gone through school and from a very young age failed and failed and failed. So I would tell you that encouraging them and like loving on them is just as important as teaching them skills. All right, Shannon. So again, student self-esteem, whoever you're working with, you know, they're going to it's going to be a struggle. Like it was really brave of them to come to you. So make sure you provide lots of positive encouragement. Also, when you're first starting out with students, it's really important that they have success early. So making your instruction so that they can be successful early. And I recognize you have a limited time, but the first couple lessons should be pretty easy for them to get success at. So just keep that in mind. It's better to start off a little easier than to start off really hard. Next one. Build relationships. And then just remember that they need constant encouragement. So sometimes someone had given an example of that strategy that that a student had learned about looking at the first letter and then guessing. Oftentimes a coping strategy is avoiding. So sometimes the strategies they have will have to be unlearned. So, and actually will impede their learning. So keep that in mind. Right, Shannon. This is just general teaching strategies for working with adults. You know, keep your lessons relevant, breaking up information. So you're presenting things in small chunks for folks. Keep them engaged. Like as a teacher, as a tutor, like you're kind of always, it's like having a little performance every day that you are kind of on all the time. So focus on your learners' experiences. Like what are their goals? Like, are they there to understand their students' school better? Are they there to get a promotion at work? Like, why are they there? And try to tailor your learning to that. That was a good example that the woman gave about the gentleman getting released soon, and then looking at what is he going to have to do, and then how she has developed developed lessons that help that. Encourage questions and discussions, be flexible. Like you have to read the room. You're going to get folks in that are having a bad day. You might have to scrap your lesson and do it a different day. If you can, give them something that they can do on their own. Folks have different levels of free time. So sometimes all they have for you is that 30 minutes that they're with you, but sometimes they have some other time. And if they can do something meaningful that will help reinforce what you've taught them, they're going to learn faster. Again, offer encouragement, and then having folks set realistic goals and relevant goals, like having them be able to set a small goal, meet the goal, will be motivating. There's lots of other things on working with adults, but these are the ones that I think are most important. Next one, Shannon. So here are some resources. They're not going to tell you what to teach, but they're going to give you some information on learning disabilities, on dyslexia, how reading develops in your brain. They're really, I think they're all good, but they'll go really far into depth about how reading develops in your brain, and you may or may not be interested in learning that.
Another resource was put in the chat. It's from a reading specialist out of Massachusetts, and the link for that individual was put in the chat if anybody would like to look at that link.
Okay, Shannon, I think that might be the end of that PowerPoint. Does anyone have questions or things I can answer? You just have a wealth of information from your folks at Wisconsin Literacy also.
I think there were some questions entered in the chat early on
Yes,
regarding other languages, especially.
Yeah, so depending on who you're working with, students, like the sounds will be similar in other languages, some will not. Some languages are based on sound, some are not. So what I would tell you, your best resource is ESL, like any kind of EL training that Wisconsin Literacy offers. What I will also tell you is that if a person if English is not their primary language, it does not mean that they wouldn't have struggles learning English at the same rate that a native speaker would. So that's just something to think about. Like when I was working in public school, we would often have students that met criteria for getting into English language services, but then also had a reading disability. So that's something to think about. The other thing I would tell you is any connections you can make back to their home language will get you further. There's some challenges, like teaching a student to read if they haven't learned to read in their home language. Obviously, not all languages are written down. So some students that are from a community that doesn't have a written language, that they're not going to have learned to read, but any connections that you can make back is really helpful. There are guides for that that can be helpful. Does that answer the question? I don't remember what the question was.
I think it did answer
Yeah.
it. The question was essentially in regards to reading challenges for people coming from other languages. And then also, as you addressed, when there's no written system in that native language.
Mhm.
English is challenging. Like Spanish is much easier, frankly, to learn than English is. So it's often confusing because we do things differently in English.
Great. Are there any other questions or comments for Angie? Feel free to unmute, raise your hand, or put it in the chat.
Carolyn has also offered in the chat, she put her email address and she's offering that if anybody would like to contact her, she'd be happy to share resources. Thank you, Carolyn.
Okay. I'm not seeing any additional questions. Any last parting thought, Angie, that you'd like to throw out there before we close off the session?
Well, I just would say thanks because you often, I know a lot of you are volunteers, but just working alongside folks in your community to help them, there just is not really enough gratitude in the world for that. So thank you for the time and effort that you put in to helping folks in your community.
Yeah. That was
Well,
beautifully said. Yes.
I'd like, yeah, this is Deb. I just want to say, Angie, that the way that you framed all of this was really helpful because as you were talking about, making different points, I was thinking about different learners and tutors that work with them and what could be used. Like you said, you weren't going to necessarily tell us what to teach or, so on. And those resources at the end were excellent, but being able to put it into my own context, which I'm sure everyone else was able to. Angie, it was great.
Well, I think, Deb, the most important thing to walk away from is you're the perfect person to be working with your learner. Like you're it, you're who they have, and you can do it. So that's not anyone else. You can do it. So
Yeah. And I loved that whole list of working with the adults. The whole thing about a relationship and encouragement is very, very affirming at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. I was just going to say that, Angie, because I know we're almost out of time, but yes, what a perfect ending to the day. Just thank you for that, hopeful and encouraging note at the end of a very informative and helpful presentation. So I just want to be respectful of everyone's time because it's been a long but a wonderful day of learning. I'll let Shannon wrap it up, but thank you, Angie, for for talking and presenting today. It was just an excellent look at dyslexia and working with students with learning challenges.